Good evening, everyone. This is Kevin Pollock with Emerging Revolutionary War here, bringing you another one of our Rev War revelries that we do every other Sunday throughout the year here on Facebook and our YouTube channel at 7 p.m. And I'm joined this evening by author and historian Elizabeth Reese to talk about the Marquis de Lafayette, but probably not the part of the Marquis de Lafayette's life that you might think of if you follow the Emerging Revolutionary War blog, but a bit of a different story as well. So we'll get into that. So, Elizabeth, how are you tonight?
I'm good, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Sure, it's a pleasure to have you, and thanks for jumping on. We were talking about before we started recording. You're probably tired of talking about the Marquis de Lafayette right now, with everything going on with the anniversary of his visit. So, before we get to the Marquis de Lafayette, tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you become interested in his life story?
I'm a public historian. I've worked at historic houses and sites my entire career. And Lafayette has if people have heard me talk before, may have heard me say this, but he's kind of been like a ghost or like a phantom following me from site to site. My first job was at Hamilton Grange National Memorial in Upper Manhattan in New York. Hamilton's house, obviously. Hamilton and Lafayette had a friendship. And then I worked at the United States Capitol building, and it was actually at the Capitol that I learned that Lafayette came back in 1824 because much of the building was finished for his arrival, including like the floor of the rotunda and the walls. And then there's this also amazing portrait of Lafayette in the House chamber that was given as a gift by the artist Ari Scheffer to the American people for Lafayette's tour, and it's one of only two paintings that is on the house floor. It's Lafayette and it's George Washington. And when I would give tours of the house, people would be like, "Who's that other guy?" I'm like, "Oh, that's Lafayette." It's just a little bit different than how we picture him as like kind of America's favorite fighting Frenchman, because when I worked there, it was peak Hamilton musical time. And I currently work at Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House in Alexandria. Woodlawn was originally the home of Nellie Custis Lewis, who is George Washington's step granddaughter, and very close with the Lafayette family. And Lafayette actually spent quite a lot of time at Woodlawn and other Custis family homes when he was in DC for his tour. And so it was actually my research on my book that kind of led me to my current position where I work today. So he's kind of followed me around. As I was wanting to learn more about his tour, I realized there's books about it, but there isn't like kind of a more recent kind of digestible book. And I found after a lifetime of working directly with the public in history that most people aren't going to pick up like a dense academic text. I do, but I find that like a lot of my job is kind of translating that denser work into things that are maybe a little bit more accessible for people that make them want to read those maybe denser things. So that was my goal with Marquis de Lafayette Returns, and it just happily coincided with the bicentennial. So Lafayette has definitely kept me busy over the last 13 months.
So Lafayette followed you around, and then you decided to follow him around. I'll let our listeners know Elizabeth's book is Marquis de Lafayette Returns, a tour of America's national capital region. It's a history and guide published with the History Press. So you followed him around quite a bit. What was the process of tracking down? What kind of research did you do to track down where was Lafayette? And how did you kind of piece together his story and his travels throughout the United States in 1824?
Yeah, fortunately, it's very well documented through primary sources, through newspapers, through journal entries. Lafayette's personal secretary, Auguste Levasseur, traveled with him and kept a journal that he published after the kind of the tour was over, and it's been translated into English, which was a great resource. I mean, you understand when you read like someone's journal who's writing kind of back to France as a way of like selling this trip almost in a way that there's going to be some biases, but piecing that with newspaper accounts, newspapers also written in the early 19th century are really different than how we digest news today. It's a lot. I think a lot more helpful for historians because there's not a lot of like flourish and like trying to like sell you on headlines. It's really telling you what happened, who was there, what was said, sometimes like what was eaten if there's a meal involved. And so and also descriptions of the crowds, but it's a lot more kind of like that minutia detail based, which I found was really helpful in this. And I also had a lot of help from the organization, the American Friends of Lafayette, who have also been very busy, quite literally following Lafayette around the whole country over the past 13 months, as well as they've been kind of gearing up for this for the past couple of decades. And they were able to pass along some resources and some stuff for me as well, which was really fun to go through. My initial plan was I was going to follow the whole tour, and then I found out that Lafayette spent about a third of his tour in the DC area, which is where I am based, which made research a lot easier, kind of being able to go to these sites as well, and also books about DC, the DC region, are not just kind of people who live in the DC area are interested in. It's a people across the nation are interested in what has happened in the history of DC as it is the nation's capital too. So that was also exciting to know that Lafayette kind of spent so much time in practically my own backyard, but also a place that was so important as our nation. And when the last time he was here, DC didn't even exist. So hearing like his response to like being in this nation. The speeches he's giving in DC is like basically the capital, the existence of the District of Columbia was what they had fought for during the Revolution. And here it was. And here were these buildings. Here was the completed Capitol building after the fire during the War of 1812, which was only 10 years prior to Lafayette's return, as like a testament to the American people and a representative government, which again, what the revolution was all about.
Yeah, really kind of a full circle moment, definitely. And you mentioned you were initially looking at your book on a larger scope of covering Lafayette's entire tour. That a future book project? Not sure you want to add
I have to
that.
say that there is a book coming out in well, by the time this, I think, well, this will be here, it'll be already be out, but Ryan Cole has written a book called The Last Adieu that really goes over a lot more detail. So yeah, I would say they work very well together if you want kind of like a little bit of a slice of Lafayette's tour. And then also not only Ryan's book is a little bit is more of the whole 13 months, but also talks about the legacy. Because as Lafayette we're on the cusp of celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Right now, we're on the cusp of waiting for the semi-quincentennial. So it's a very similar moment in American history, and Lafayette's arrival was kind of this reflection of the Revolutionary period, where now we're having this reflection of 1776 and beyond, and how our nation has evolved and changed over the past 250 years. That was very much happening during Lafayette's tour too.
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of a cool way that you get to look at how people 200 years ago viewed, looking back 50 years, the American Revolution. You can kind of compare it to today and how people are looking back, as we get into
Yeah.
the semi-quincentennial. You said it much better than I do. I'm still getting used to saying that. 250th sounds better, but either
Yeah,
way,
and
people know what we mean.
bicentennial rolls off the tongue so much easier. 50 years ago, I think it was a bit easier, but yeah, the 250th. It's interesting because so much of what the nation was, what was happening when Lafayette returned, is this much active mourning because the veterans of the Revolution were older or had already passed. Because Lafayette was a major general at so young, at 19 years old. He is the last surviving major general of the Revolution when he returns. So there is this huge transitionary period that's happening in American history, which there's a massive transitionary period and moment that's happening now too. So it's different, but there's absolute parallels from Lafayette's tour to America today, as this like great unknown it was happening with who was going to lead the nation. The election of 1824 was a huge moment that happened during Lafayette's tour. It was the first election where none of the candidates had like served in the Revolution, at least like in like enlistment service, or had a hand in the nation's founding documents. And you end up having this large field that gets narrowed down to really Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams is the heir of this like almost American like elite family, and Andrew Jackson, who's representing the common man, and who's going to lead the nation? Where is this going to step foot? Well, this is the very first time we've had a president that's hasn't had a hand in the founding of it. And so that was a huge, huge moment during Lafayette's tour when people are not really getting along. People are coming together for Lafayette, and to celebrate his service, his selfless service. He was not an American by birth, but he chose to come and fight for this nation. And yeah, there's quite literal accounts of members of Congress screaming and fighting with each other on the floor of the House or the Senate. The very next day, eating together at Lafayette's table and raising a toast to the prosperity of the nation, which is quite interesting.
I'm sure everybody wanted to get a glimpse of Lafayette as he returned, certainly.
Yeah.
So I want to get into the details of Lafayette's return in just a moment, and especially in his uh, time around the national capital, which of course you spent a lot of time researching. But obviously, there's a big gap in time in Lafayette's life between the end of the American Revolution and him coming back to the United States in 1824. So give us a few minutes, kind of a brief overview. What happens to Lafayette in all that time between the end of the American Revolution and the time he comes back?
So after Yorktown, pretty much very shortly after Yorktown, he heads back home, heads up north, and then heads home to France. He does come back to the United States in 1784. It's kind of like a mini tour. It's a precursor to the much larger tour that would happen 40 years later. And the real purpose of that tour was for him to be able to spend time with George Washington outside of like the theater of war. So he spends 2 weeks at Mount Vernon, um, when he's here during that time. And he goes back to France with the intention of coming back. He wants to visit, he wants to bring his wife, he wants to bring his children, to show them the country that he loved so much. But what happens in the late 1780s is the quasi-war breaks out between France and the United States, and then the French Revolution is starting to happen too. So these political and military movements that are happening prevent him from really returning. And during the French Revolution, especially, for America, Lafayette was representative elected government. For France, Lafayette was a constitutional monarchist, and he believed that the French system of the royal family, the nobles, and everyone else, would be better served through more like ironically like a British style of parliament where the people have representation and a voice, but the monarchy still does exist, just not as powerful. As the French Revolution escalates, that's not a really popular stance to have, especially as like the reign of terror is really happening. And Lafayette finds himself really torn between two sides. He is a member of the French noble class, and he's torn between his station in French society and the common people. And it's as tension starts to grow, he's realizing I really have to get out of here. And he tries to flee with the hopes of coming to America. And he doesn't make it. He is imprisoned for 5 years. At the same time, his wife is imprisoned, and pretty much everyone in his wife's family is a victim of the terror. They are guillotined, and the day before his wife is scheduled for execution, her life is spared through the work of James Monroe and James Monroe's wife, Elizabeth Courtwright, who is serving as the minister to France. And so once she gets out of prison, she goes to look for her husband. She finds out he's imprisoned in Austria, goes to meet with the officials there, asking if he can be free. They say, of course not. And she goes, okay, great. I'm going to be imprisoned with him. And our daughters are going to join us in prison too. They had a son, but the son being the male heir of Lafayette, he kind of had a pretty big target on his back. So she sends their son to America, where he ends up living with George Washington at Mount Vernon, first at the president's house in Philadelphia, and then at Mount Vernon for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. So Lafayette and his wife and their two daughters are imprisoned in Olmütz, which is still a prison to this day, and basically solitary confinement. And so when they are released, this is again when he tries to come back to America. This is when the quasi-war is breaking out, and he's really encouraged not to come, which is ironic because had Lafayette returned to America at this time period, he probably would have been forced to choose a political party. There's this letter that he writes to Alexander Hamilton being like, hey, had a rough time over here. Can I come stay with you? And Hamilton is like, I have never believed that France can become a republic. I believe that like while this continues, it can only produce misfortunes. I give you this on the faith of our former friendship. It's a pretty nasty letter, but he does sign it by saying the only thing in which our parties agree is to love you. And by not coming to America and not being like parceled into Federalist or Democratic Republican, Lafayette remains this neutrally beloved figure. So that even when he comes back in 1824, he doesn't belong to a political party. He belongs to all of America. So I think had he come in the 1790s, things would have been maybe a little bit different. We may have had a different kind of a view of him. Shortly after their release from imprisonment, his wife, her health greatly suffered and she passes away. And so while Lafayette wanted to return, he had family matters. So doesn't have the opportunity to come back until 1824. And earlier that year, Monroe writes to Lafayette. Monroe is now president at this time, asking if he would like to come as this kind of like precursor to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. And Monroe has his own reasons for doing this. Obviously, it is to celebrate the 50th, but what happens after the War of 1812 is that this sense of national unity really comes into play. It's not until the War of 1812 that Americans start viewing themselves collectively, like as Americans. Prior to this, you would have been a Virginian, a Marylander, a New Yorker, Pennsylvania, so on and so forth. But this sense of like unity and America kind of comes out of this war. Does everyone agree on what it means to be an American? No, absolutely not. But Monroe wants to continue this sense of unity, and he believes that bringing Lafayette is a way to kind of bring Americans together. And he's not wrong. And it's also to help like boost morale because after these years of war, people are not really in a celebratory mood. So Lafayette is kind of the precursor to the 50th anniversary celebrations, which would be coming up in a few years after that. Monroe says that trip would like be paid for. He offered to send a ship. Lafayette says no. He does not want this to be seen as any sort of political thing. He wants to be seen as like a personal thing. He arranges his own travel. He has his son, George Washington Lafayette, to come with him and his personal secretary, as I mentioned. And they come back to America for the first time. And for Lafayette, it would have been 40 years. For his son, a little less time than that. And they arrive in the New York Harbor in the middle of August in 1824.
So were there announcements planned ahead of time? Did people kind of know Lafayette's route as he was traveling throughout and people said, he's going to be here tomorrow? Or was it all kind of spontaneous as he was traveling, where he went, and the obvious public reactions to Lafayette showing up?
Yeah, it's a mix of the two. So originally his tour was almost supposed to mirror his 1784 tour. He was only supposed to be here for 4 months. As more people knew that he was in town, he got more and more invitations to come to cities and towns and visit. My favorite is in Pennsylvania. I believe it's his trip to York. They had heard that he was in it's either York or Harrisburg. My apologies to the lovely people of both towns. Um, but he's in one of these towns and they know that he's around, and so they're like, "Oh, he's gonna have to come back through our town, so we're gonna catch him and like get him to come and have him stop for a night." So things like that were happening. One thing I haven't been able to determine is if there was any sort of like formality, who was handling like this schedule. Lafayette writes about like we're told that we're gonna have to visit this place and this place, like friends. But that is I'm sure the answer is out there. I didn't come across it in my research. But the reception was pure pandemonium. People went crazy for Lafayette. There was Lafayette merchandise that you could buy. You could get gloves with his face on it. There's a account he's at a ball in Philadelphia, and a young woman places her hand for him to kiss it, and she has a glove with Lafayette's face on it, and he says that he would not kiss his own face. You could buy ribbon badges, which are ribbons, which was a very popular thing. It was usually one of the like the more affordable pieces, but stores would advertise before they knew Lafayette was coming to town that you could buy Lafayette ribbons with his face. You could buy um like pottery, kind of like ceramics. That was really popular too. There are some pretty unique things. Cockades with Lafayette's face is another common easy thing. But what's interesting is that there's no like set like gender or even kind of like class of items. Like things are not everything is not super expensive, everything is not super inexpensive. Things are not just for women, they're not just for men, they're not just for children, it's for everyone. And so it really was this kind of collective moment. When we study history and we study like major events, these events tend to happen in like one place at one time. But what's interesting about Lafayette's tour is that it happens everywhere. And so you find that so many people have their own Lafayette story. And what comes out of this is one of the first major accounts of tourism in the United States, where people are traveling from outside of their home for one event or person, Lafayette in this case, to see him. And it's not even like the guarantee to see him. Sometimes it's just to see him in a crowd, and then to write that they saw him from a distance, or maybe they perhaps got to shake his hand, or they like were in a receiving line at a ball where they got to see him. In the winter of 1824. Lafayette really kind of hunkers down in the DC area. It's winter. He's 67 years old. Traveling at this time is not incredibly pleasant for anyone, but especially him, who's had quite a few injuries in his life. So he uses DC as his home base, and when people hear that Lafayette is staying in one area, they go. So like taverns and boarding houses reach kind of maximum occupancy in a time where very few people are coming to Washington. Congress is not particularly active during the holiday season. And so people are coming for the sake of hoping to see him at like the theater or a dinner or some sort of event that he was attending. So that was a pretty unique thing to come across, considering that in the 1820s, the odds of you leaving the county you were born in were very slim to none. And then you see people traveling and these numbers, especially of these smaller towns of the people gathered, exceeding the recorded population at the time, shows that people were temporarily coming to see him.
So with all this public fervor over trying to see Lafayette, and I love that you mentioned that people came to not even necessarily meet him, but just to see him in a crowd. Um, Thinking about how humans tend to remember big events that happen in their lives. During your research, did you find any fun stories of people who really embellished what happened when they, like, oh, I got to shake Lafayette's hand, and then, you look at the actual sources and you find out that person wasn't even born yet or anything like that.
Yeah,
Um,
there's definitely a couple instances of that. I've seen it a lot with like people saying, "Oh, they were his translator. They were traveling with him, like throughout the tour." And there's a lot of accounts of these. And what I kind of go to for the like major events like that is Levasseur's journals are a really good resource for like who was aiding, who was helping people, who was helping them in this time period. And sometimes these people's names have never shown up. So it would be a very easy thing to be like, yes, yes, I was Lafayette's translator throughout the whole tour. And he didn't use one. But an easy thing to tell your friends and family of being like connected to a moment in history.
Yeah, I'm sure there was probably plenty of that.
Oh yeah.
Um, so Lafayette lands and he comes ashore in New York Harbor. Like you said, he spends a lot of the winter in the Washington D.C. area. So does he just sort of work his way south from New York? What are some other highlights as he comes south from New York toward the Washington D.C. area?
Yeah, he kind of moves up north first and heads up to Boston. He's at the dedication ceremony for the Bunker Hill Monument. And if you are familiar with Lafayette's story and have heard that he is buried in American soil, it is soil from Bunker Hill. He did not take a barrel of soil, lug it around with him for 13 months. He sent for it later, but that is a moment that he helped dedicate that monument and then is also buried with soil from Bunker Hill when he is buried in Paris, when he dies in 1834. He kind of loops back around. He heads down into Philadelphia. He visits old friends along the way or people that he had known. He visits with every living president who's still around at this time period, veterans that he had known, and even maybe people he didn't remember. But what I think is really admirable about him, there's two ways to look at this. He had the best memory of anyone and maybe his human history, or he was very good at making people feel important and making people feel valued. If he came across a soldier and they said, I fought with you at Yorktown, he would say, ah, yes, I remember, like how wonderful it is to see you, which I think is such an admirable, wonderful trait of him, which is plays into like why he is so beloved and remembered. He made an impact on the American people. They felt connected to him. Through him, they felt connected to something bigger than themselves, the creation of this country and the war that was fought to declare its independence. And from doing so, they pass him along to the next generation. The children are named after him. Youth are a huge part of this tour too. And so the reason why we know Lafayette is through this tour, through streets being named after him, towns. The only town that he visits that is named after him during the tour is Fayetteville, North Carolina. So he visits that on the tour, named after him. But he comes down to DC by the fall of 1824. He visits Washington for the very first time on October 12th. Prior to that, he had spent some time in Baltimore. And today, we may not think this. I grew up outside of Baltimore, so Baltimore is very near and dear to me. But Baltimore was an arts and cultural capital at this time. It was an older city than Washington. Washington is a planned city. It's a new city at this time period. Baltimore also had a huge French population, and they were feted with French their fellow Frenchmen around them. So when they come to DC after having been in Baltimore, they're a little bit disappointed because it is pretty sparse. It's a much smaller population. And Levasseur writes something along the lines of like, there's like 2 miles between the Capitol and the White House and nothing in between. It's going to take like several years to fill up this town. So I can't like you have this like beautiful Capitol building and like houses, but very, very different than how we view DC today. Um, yeah, he has a huge reception at the Capitol. He gets to see the rotunda, which was finished in time for his arrival, and is feted at the White House. And what's important about DC is not only what I mentioned, it being like the capital city that was created in the interim 40 years that since he had last been here, but it was very close to Alexandria and the home of George Washington. George Washington had died in 1799. Lafayette received news of his death 2 months after Washington died. And you think of how news travels, obviously much slower in that time period. But Lafayette had never had an opportunity to physically mourn Washington in the place that he had known him. So he going to the DC area, visiting Mount Vernon was a huge, huge part of this trip. And the fact that it happened so early on in the middle of October really brings out a lot of this imagery of Washington and Lafayette together and like reminding the American people of the bond that Washington and Lafayette had. Lafayette, who was orphaned before he was 13 years old, Washington, who had no biological children of his own, he raised his stepchildren and step-grandchildren. But they really saw something that they were missing in each other. And Lafayette had a closeness with Washington that really none of the other aides or soldiers or officers in the Revolution had. There are instances of Lafayette coming and like embracing Washington in the French way, with like a kiss on either cheek, which Washington, I feel like, is one of those figures where you forget he had a personality because of how we kind of view him as this like stoic father figure of the nation. So Lafayette goes to mourn Washington at the old tomb, and what comes of that is a lot of like imagery, again, reminding people that like these two men together are the reason why we have our nation and one of these men has died, and many of these men who have died, but Lafayette is still here, which kind of becomes a larger theme as the tour goes down into the southern states, into the western states at the time, which is Ohio. But he visits all 24 states that exist in the time in these 13 months. So he covers a lot of ground. I think it's about 6,000 miles. And this is all by carriage. Lafayette couldn't ride a horse anymore. He had suffered injuries after his famous injury at Brandywine. And so this is all through carriage, coach, steamboat. That's the new invention of the time period, which I don't know how he kept up with him. I kept up with him for 1 week last October, and I had to take like 3 days off of work to recover.
We won't tell anybody. Had there been anything like this really in American history prior to, I mean, you talk about visiting all 24 states. I know Washington made some tours, obviously, in the years after the Revolution, but I mean, this seems like just an incredibly large tour party, whatever you want to call it, I guess, reception
Yeah.
for Lafayette here in the United States.
A nonstop party for 13 straight months. No, nothing to this scale. Like you mentioned, Washington had done some tours. Alexis de Tocqueville does one later, kind of inspired by how Lafayette. There's a couple that happened after, but um, not before. Lafayette is really this kind of like first to do this in a way. Which again, like I mentioned, how this is so much of how we remember him is through this tour. Yes, of course, we would still know who Lafayette is, but the fact that this happened a generation and a half after the Revolution helps to keep him relevant in American memory. And of course, when you were naming streets and towns and schools and things after him, that's going to have him, which I find that today, I mean, the Hamilton musical has kind of changed how people know of Lafayette. But prior to that, it would be like, oh yeah, I know I've heard of the name, but I don't really know what he did. The tour is the reason why we even have that. We know the name. Maybe people have a better sense of what he did. Like because they know him as America's favorite fighting Frenchman. But it helps to bring that into the next generation and kind of instill the values of the revolution to a generation that wasn't alive when it happened. To kind of equate it to something that's happening now, World War II veterans. That it's a very similar kind of environment. Many of them are gone, and the memories and the stories and what they experienced goes with them. And so, how do the children and grandchildren and great grandchildren of these people make sure these stories are remembered? That's very similar to what was happening with Lafayette.
Well, and thankfully, like you said, there's so much out there recording Lafayette's visit. So what's your favorite story, if you had to pick one, I guess, of Lafayette's visit here to the United States?
One, I don't, it sounds like a particular story. It's something he does quite often. But I am very impressed by how he used his very strong personal political beliefs and how that was at odds with a lot of what was happening in America at the time, specifically talking about slavery. Lafayette was an adamant anti-slavery. He had plans, which back in the 1780s wrote to Washington about, like, I have this great plan that I want to share with you. We can do something about this institution. We can end it. Lafayette follows through with it. Washington writes back saying, like, we'll talk about it more when we see each other. Because, of course, Washington isn't going to put those feelings into writing. He's very aware that every piece of paper he writes on is going to be preserved for the next 250 hundreds of years after. So that was a conversation that they very likely had when Lafayette came back to America in 1784. And if I could be a fly on the wall of like any moment in history, that's in the top five. But it's very likely Lafayette had an influence on Washington's decision to free the people that he enslaved in his will in 1799. Lafayette in the 1780s, he purchases property in French Guiana. He purchases several plantations with the idea that people would be gradually emancipated, people would be paid wages, they would be educated, there would be no corporal punishment, there would be strict punishment at all, and any sort of punishment would be the same regardless of race. The unfortunate thing about the Cayenne experiments is that they were never really a success nor a failure. When Lafayette is imprisoned during the French Revolution, all of his property is seized, and so the people who were being emancipated through this were then sold back into slavery. And actually, I think there is a scholar who's doing research on who these people were and who their descendants are. So that will be a very exciting project to learn more about. But when Lafayette comes back in 1824, this is 40 years prior to the Civil War. This is a massive thing that's happening. That many of these events, people were barred based on race. It was only for white people. And what Lafayette does is he knows that this is happening and he intentionally goes around it, not in a way where he's kind of like lecturing Americans on their moral shortcomings. He doesn't use his position to like speak about this. He does it in a more subtle way. And a couple examples of this are he would recognize people that he had known. There was a man that, when Lafayette arrived to America in 1777, the first faces he saw were Black faces. He saw a man who attended to him when he was in Georgetown, South Carolina, called him up to him, embraced him. He is reunited with James Armistead Lafayette, who was an enslaved man who worked as a double agent to the benefit of the Americans under Lafayette during Yorktown. He sees him again in Virginia, embraces him publicly in the crowd, and he knows that people aren't going to tell him no. And so he's showing things that like this is a normal way of doing things. He's not making a big scene about it, but like this is what this can be. In New Orleans, he requests a meeting with Black veterans of the War of 1812. When he was told that couldn't happen, he presses on it a little bit and he gets it to happen. He's not only doing this in public, he's doing it in private too. And I guess this is probably my favorite like account. He is at Monticello for a long period of time, about 2 weeks during his tour. And on one of these instances, he's in a carriage with Thomas Jefferson, and they're going from Monticello to the University of Virginia. And Lafayette uses this opportunity to kind of pressure Jefferson about slavery, saying, "You wrote this amazing document. You said that all men are created equal, yet you have slaves. How can that be?" And the reason why we know that this instance happened is because the man who was driving the carriage was an enslaved man named Israel Jefferson. And he is interviewed about it decades later in a series called The Life Among the Lowly. And he says that he had never forgotten it. And so rarely do we hear these stories being told through Black people and through people who were enslaved. It's usually through newspapers. It's usually white writers who are writing about it. George Washington Parke Custis has a similar instance that happens at Arlington House that he writes about. But this is through a man who was enslaved, who is hearing this story about hearing what Lafayette said to Jefferson's happening right behind him. And that makes it a very unique instance of this happening. I also think it's a testament to who Lafayette was, that he was friends with Thomas Jefferson and friends with people like Alexander Hamilton, two diametrically opposed figures in American history, and he was equally good friends with both of them. And so, yeah, he had a really unique way of making his point and his views known, without kind of like alienating or removing himself from people, which I'm not saying that that's like how we should do things or how we shouldn't do things. It's just very different than how we kind of approach issues today, which really stood out to me.
Yeah, he really appealed to everybody, like you said, no matter what your race was, what your political persuasion was, anything like that. So I want to talk, you touched on it a little bit. You talked about, Lafayette has the portrait in the House of Representatives today, along with George Washington. And you mentioned he comes to see the rotunda. So why is Lafayette's portrait in the House of Representatives today? And I think, if I remember correctly from one of your previous talks that I've seen, Lafayette bears a very unique and is the only type of this person in American history to have done this. So tell us a little bit about that, his time at the Capitol building too.
Yeah, the portrait in the Capitol is not like a totally off the wall, like the artist gave us this gift and we have nowhere else to put it. In December of 1824, Lafayette was the first foreign dignitary to address Congress. And to this day, he is the only private non-citizen to have had this honor. So he stands alone. He addressed Congress in the House chamber, which is now National Statuary Hall. And so now they moved into their newer chamber in the 1850s, but that was the room where he addressed Congress. And in addition to his address, thanking the American people, Congress also had a gift for him. They also gave him basically a repayment of what he had spent during the Revolution. He spent about $200,000. This is 1770s, 1780s money. They gave him a repayment of that without interest. Another interesting thing I found is that that was not a unanimous yes that Congress gave him the money. They were fighting about it until the day before that it was to be awarded. So it almost didn't happen, but he got a repayment of what he had spent during the Revolution. And he also got a land grant near present-day Tallahassee, Florida. He sells off that land eventually. He does not move to Florida, but that was also part of it as well. But yeah, it's a Lafayette is still has the honor of being the first private non-citizen to have had that honor. And yeah, the very first foreign dignitary to address Congress. So when we have these like joint sessions of Congress and foreign dignitaries come to talk, well, Lafayette was the first. He does get citizenship posthumously. Um, he got citizenship for him and his male heirs through the states of Maryland and Virginia, but those were awarded before the Constitution was ratified. And so Congress did not make the necessary measures on like a federal national level to make Lafayette a citizen until 2002.
Oh wow.
So very recent. And he's either like the sixth or like the fifth person to have had that honor. So he joins the ranks of people like Winston Churchill to have his honorary citizenship.
That's pretty amazing, and obviously just a testament to what Americans then, and even still to a certain extent, I think today, think of Lafayette.
Yeah.
So obviously, your book is not just a telling of the story of Lafayette's visit in the National Capital Region, but it's also a guide to the sites that Lafayette visited. So, did you get out? I assume you got out and visited a lot of these sites and took pictures and whatnot for the book. What's probably, I'll ask two questions, I guess, about this. What's your favorite site that you feature in the book that Lafayette visited that people can go visit today? And what's, in your opinion, the best, like lesser known site? Like obviously people can go see the Capitol and take
Yeah.
tours to the Capitol where Lafayette was, but what's one that's maybe a bit off the beaten path that you really enjoy visiting?
There's, well, I could, okay. There's one, I found out that Lafayette, I grew up in a really small town between Baltimore and Frederick, Maryland. Lafayette, it's on the National Road, and Lafayette passed through our town. There was a kind of this like rumor that he had had breakfast at this place nearby, which may or may not have happened. It's again one of those kind of stories where it's like legend states it's very
It's
possible
one of those
that
George
he
Washington slept here type stories, yeah.
yeah, he did. There was a reception at like the town just down the road, like quite literally down the hill from where this little inn was. So it's very likely he stopped in to continue down. That I guess that's like the lesser known place because it's truly in the middle of nowhere. And the only reason Lafayette went there was because he had received an invitation from the citizens of Frederick to visit. He was in Baltimore. He's like, oh, I have to be in DC by New Year's, but I'll swing by and visit. So that's how he passed through. Um, I guess a place that means a lot, like stands out to me, is the fact Woodlawn. I mean, Woodlawn is biased because I do work there, but it's a place when he visited, spent so much time in the DC area. A huge draw of that was being able to spend time with the Custis's, and the Custis's are Martha's grandchildren through her first marriage, but the two youngest Custis's, Nellie, whose home is Woodlawn, and Wash, whose home is Arlington House. They were raised at Mount Vernon. And so Lafayette knew them from his visit in 1784. He remained in correspondence with them for the rest of his life. And his son knew them too. George and Nellie were actually the same age. And so when he was sent to live with the Washingtons at Mount Vernon, George and grew up with them as well. And so what he gets from visiting with the Custis's is privacy. There's not a lot of accounts of what was said and what was done during these visits. We have letters from Nellie at Woodlawn saying how lovely it was to have her like most paternal friend here in her home. But instead of staying at like a hotels, inns, or other people's strangers' homes, he was staying with people he knew very well. And so I find his time at places like Tudor Place in Georgetown, Arlington House, and Woodlawn is an opportunity where he can kind of like take the facade off a little bit because you have to imagine that you're meeting millions and millions of people. You're traveling all across the United States. It's just it has to be exhausting. And to be able to spend time with the family of the man that he revered above everyone else was like a respite for him. And so not only do I get to work in the place where he walked the very same places, but knowing that that was kind of a little bit of a likely a sanctuary for him in the midst of all this craziness is pretty cool. And it's still open for tours. And we have a couple Lafayette things that you can come and see all year round.
And I'm sure Lafayette definitely needed a place to rest after all the touring that he did. So we're coming up towards the end, but I do have two other questions for you. So while we're having this conversation, we're obviously getting toward the end of, I almost said the 250th, the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit to the United States. And I think, at least within our history circle, it seems there has been a lot of it's been getting a lot of attention. There's been a lot of new roadside markers that have been put up. I know one just down the road from me in Buckland was put up just a few weeks ago, marking his visit to Buckland in Prince William County. So obviously we're getting toward the end of that, but kind of what was your takeaway of the commemoration of the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit? Obviously, it's slightly different because Lafayette's not here like he was 200 years ago. But in some ways, I think there were a lot of similarities too. I saw a lot of large events. I know you had talked about, I'm blanking on the name of the group, so I apologize, but that had been organizing basically to the minute that Lafayette was at these places, they were doing events there as well, which is pretty cool. So I guess what talk about that a little bit, and what is it about Lafayette that still 200 years later sticks
Yeah.
with people that we're going to put up signs and we're going to come out to block parties with, Lafayette reenactors out and whatnot.
So the celebrations have been way more than like the turnout and people's enthusiasm beyond my expectations. I have found and met so many people that are like, I'm just curious about him, but it's wonderful to be able to come together and celebrate things. Like in 1824, we were a very divided nation. We're there's elements of that is still very much today. And what I have heard really unanimously is that for people to come together to learn something about their history, learn about a similar moment in history and how people came together through that, has been very inspiring for them. It's wanting them to know they wanted to learn more about this time period in America's history. Because when we learn in school, we go from like the Revolution. Maybe you get the War of 1812. Again, if you're from the Baltimore area like me, then you absolutely get the War of 1812. But then you just skip right to the Civil War, and so much is happening in this antebellum period. And I think Lafayette's visit is providing a highlight on what is happening in this like in between war kind of period as we kind of like look at it. What has been also very exciting is, like I mentioned, that unlike a historic event that has happened in one place at one time, this has happened all throughout the 24 states. So it's been a wonderful opportunity for people, smaller organizations, smaller towns, to highlight their connection to America, this large moment in American history, what happened, and highlight their area's role in this. I'm a huge advocate of local history. I think local history is some of the most powerful ways that people can get involved and learn more. If you know what's happening in your own backyard, that's going to open the doors for so many things. And I think this is a really amazing example of that because it's not like, oh, well, Bunker Hill was happening up there and I live in South Carolina. What does that have to do with me? You can see what this had to do with your town when he came through. And for some places, this is still my tiny little town I grew up in. It's still one of the biggest things that's ever happened. Was when Lafayette passed through on a December morning. As for what resonates with Lafayette today, I think he represents all of what the hope for America was. He was someone who was not, again, not an American by birth. He was inspired and dedicated his life and was willing to die for the cause of America. I also think he is an eternal optimist. I lovingly refer to him as America's golden retriever. He has this wonderful, gregarious personality that stands out among his peers. When you read a letter that's written by Lafayette, and if you can't read his handwriting, there's transcriptions, but I highly recommend people to go on Founders Online. They have wonderful transcriptions of everyone's letters. Read some of Lafayette's letters. Once you get past the weird capitalization that he capitalizes almost like the first letter of every word, he's funny. He is engaging. He writes in a way that like you can see his personality. Whereas you have Washington and Jefferson knowing these letters are going to be preserved and maybe they're withholding parts of themselves. He doesn't do that. And I find that is so refreshingly modern. He's also very progressive in his views. He's forward thinking. He's not really living in the moment. Um, but he's living in the moment in the way of like, hey, there are issues that are happening. We don't have to wait for the next generation to fix them. We can do them now. And I think that's just very inspiring to people. Inspiring to me. I have a rule that I'm not allowed, personal rule, I'm not allowed to love or hate historical figures. I don't know them. He makes it very hard to honor that because I have a great affinity for him. And I have been talking about him for a very long time, but I do not get bored of talking about him because I think he represents so much of hope and good. And although he is not here, we are. And if we are inspired by him, we have the ability to carry what made him so special into our lives, into our communities, into the work that we do, not even just as historians or people who like history, but the work that we do as human beings on this planet. And I hope that's what people take away from the the tour and beyond.
That's great. Very well said. I did have one last question pop into my mind that'd be a little bit fun. Obviously, I appreciate your desire to not love or hate anybody from history. And I think that's for a historian, that's a great thing to be able to do. And like you said, it can be difficult at times, in both directions to love or hate somebody. But you've sort of lived with Lafayette, if you will, for a lot of your life, or at least had Lafayette
Yeah.
in your life. So you kind of almost in a way come to know him a little bit, like you said, reading his letters, getting a sense of his personality and whatnot. So if Lafayette could return today and take your book and use it as his guide to retrace his steps through the region, what do you think would surprise or impress him about the area today, besides, the fact that there are actual buildings between the Capitol and the White House now
Yeah,
in
well, that
Washington?
definitely.
Yeah.
I think the amount of people, and I think that the demographic makeup of America would impress him as like, oh, we're so much closer to this ideal of an America for all people. I think he would still say that we have a lot of work to do. He was never someone to kind of just rest and be like, all right, that's enough. He was fighting until the very end of his life for the equality of human rights. And I think he would say we still have more work to do, but we're definitely getting there. I think he would be intrigued by the preservation of history, especially I'm thinking like in the DC area with house museums. I think that would interest him, especially the Washington centered places. I think he would be more likely to go on a Washington slept here trail than his own.
I could see that. That would probably make sense for Lafayette. Uh, well, so is there anything that we haven't touched on? I know obviously we've talked for a good bit, but there's so much to Lafayette's story, not just his visit in 1824, 1825, but the rest of his life as well. So anything that we haven't touched on that you think you want to bring up?
If you're interested in Lafayette, there are some wonderful other books to like continue your knowledge. Mike Duncan has a wonderful biography. It's a great audiobook too. He's a podcaster, so he reads his own audiobook if you're a fan of having someone read to you, called The Hero of Two Worlds. Laura Oricchio has another wonderful book called Marquis Reconsidered. She's an art historian, and she has a kind of like more like a different approach than just kind of a normal biography. And I mentioned Ryan Cole's new book, The Last Adieu. If you just can't get enough of this tour and you want to know more, I just encourage people to read. And I'm hoping maybe one day we'll get a Lafayette miniseries to see his story explored on the big screen or silver screen or TV screen in some sort of way. So.
I was thinking about that throughout our conversation. I'm glad you brought that up because I was like, I can't think of one, but there has to be one out there. So I
He
guess we,
shows up and stuff. He's in
yeah.
like the TV show Turn. He was in the Franklin miniseries. I loved that
Mhm.
portrayal of him. I think that is like you forget he's a teenager, and that show reminds you he is a child. But it captures his personality so well. And so I don't know, I'm hoping that in the result of this bicentennial, people are like, hey, that's a really good story. Why haven't we told that yet? So
Yeah.
if that's the case, I'd be honored to be involved.
And with Ken Burns, documentary coming out on the American
Right.
Revolution, like there's obviously going to be a lot of attention paid to this period coming up, and Lafayette is gonna, I think, feature as a big part of it, as he should. So Elizabeth, where can people get a copy of your book if they're interested in following in the footsteps of Lafayette in the DC region?
You can get my book wherever books are sold. I always recommend bookshop.org. It also supports indie bookstores, and that's my go-to place for getting books. And if you would like to know more about the work that I do, you can visit my website, elizabethmreese.com. And I still have some Lafayette speaking engagements before I transition into my next project. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, Elizabeth, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing more of Lafayette's story with us tonight. And folks, if you have stumbled upon this on our YouTube channel or any social media, make sure to hit the subscribe button, follow our blog at emergingrevolutionarywar.org. And again, we do these revelries every other Sunday night. So stay tuned to our YouTube and social media channels. We have plenty on the backlog as well. So we have hours and hours and hours of content for great stuff with great authors and historians talking about the American Revolution. So continue to follow us at Emerging Revolutionary War. And good night, everybody. Elizabeth, thank you again for taking time to talk about a topic that you're clearly very interested in and very passionate about, which is great.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.